Hello again, listeners. Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Trust is a core concept to any implementation of effective leadership. If you want to be a good leader and a good manager, you have to have the trust of your people, but you also have to place trust in your people. It's also hugely important for all kinds of walks of life, not just leadership. As we're going to learn today, it's central even just to the functioning of society. And so I'm joined today by Darryl Stickel, who is an expert, very well-established expert, over 20 years experience and a PhD under his belt in trust and building it in your teams, in your life, with your friends, colleagues, family members, and so on. He also has some really interesting thoughts on leadership and how that combines with trust and how leaders can rebuild trust if and when it's lost. So we're going to be talking about all sorts of things today, and I hope you will find it useful.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Darryl, thank you so much for getting up at 6:30 in the morning, your time, to join us today. Very much appreciate that.
Oh, it's worth it for you and your audience, David.
Oh, too kind, too kind. Well, let's kick off then by letting you explain what you do, a bit about your background, and what gets you out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, so I teach people how to build trust or build stronger relationships. And I started, I grew up in a small town in northern Canada, pretty isolated place. And people had to pull together. The environment was harsh. You couldn't just drive by somebody on the side of the road. We all had to kind of pull together, and that doesn't mean that everyone was nice to each other, far from it, but there was a sense of community there. And so as someone growing up in that environment, I developed this notion that if you could help people, you should. And I had a series of events occur to me as a young man. I was playing hockey at a fairly high level when I was 17. I got attacked by a fan with a club. Knocked me unconscious, just about killed me. And I went from being someone who was planning on using his brain for a living to having the attention span of a fruit fly. And it was the mid 80s. And so I developed a stronger sense of empathy for others because I went through this harrowing experience. I had the experience of feeling helpless, hopeless. And somehow those experiences translated into me really connecting with other people. I moved to Victoria, a larger center on the west coast of Canada, and I was going to university. I'd be sitting on the bus and complete strangers would sit next to me and say, I'm really having a hard time. And so I wanted to understand what it was that caused people to open up to me like that. And so I started working with families in crisis, troubled teens, working at crisis lines, those kinds of things, to hone those skills and to try to better understand them. And I came really close to becoming a clinical psychologist, and realized that a lot of the people I was working with were just doing the best they could. And that it had taken them a long time for things to go horribly awry, and it was going to take a long time, if ever, for them to recover. And so I shifted, went into public administration, did a master's degree in public admin, and worked in native land claims in British Columbia, where they would ask me these sort of deep philosophical questions, things like, what is self-government? Or what will the province look like 50 years after claims are settled? The last question they asked me was, how do we convince a group of people we've shafted for over 100 years they should trust us? And I thought, wow, that's a good question. And it got me thinking about these long-term disputes that we see in the world and why they're so resilient, why they last so long and seem to be immune from our attempts to resolve them. And so I went to Duke, wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments, and developed a model for understanding how people come to trust one another. And then I got hired by McKinsey & Company, a big management consulting firm. And they discovered I had good client hands. They said, you're really good with clients, so we're going to send you to the worst places possible. And so I find myself, in deepest, darkest Alabama, working at a cement plant or someplace where there'd been a strike or things had gone wrong or they didn't want us there, trying to resolve things with clients. And so I was getting a chance to practice these things. 2001, I was involved in a car accident on the way to a client site, and I ended up with post-concussion syndrome, which meant that I couldn't work 80 hours a week anymore. And so I started a small company called Trust Unlimited. One of my former colleagues at McKinsey had become head of strategy for a mutual fund company, said, just come talk to us. We're trying to figure out what we're going to do. And so I find myself in front of several hundred people talking about sustainable competitive advantage, saying, that means you've got an advantage on your competitors that they can't copy, but you don't do anything I can't copy. I could buy one share of every fund you have, and now I know how they're all built. And so I don't have to pay the fund advisor. I could sell what you sell at a discount. I said, the only thing you can do is build deep, long-term relationships with your customers. And they said, that's it. That's our strategy. And so for 18 months, I trained everyone. I developed the first workshop. And we trained the whole staff, the sales staff, the marketing team, worked with the management team. After 18 months, they came back. They said, okay, so we've hired a professional survey firm, found out that trust is the primary driver of the sales decision, and that we're dramatically more trusted than anyone else in the industry in Canada. And they generated 75 cents of every new dollar that came into the industry for the next 2 years. And so I knew from what I'd experienced that what I had worked. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. And so I spent the next 20 years helping people understand what trust is, how it works, and how to build it. Sorry, I kind of went on a bit of a rant there.
No, that's great. And it's such an interesting concept, trust, isn't it? And you talked there about the positives that it can achieve for a business, but I know something else you speak about as well is how it can also lead to problems. So how is trust the root of so many of the world's problems today?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think often the lack of trust creates problems for us. We see when we've got high trust settings, we give each other the benefit of the doubt. We have grace for each other. We have this positive narrative about each other that leads to us interpreting evidence in a positive light. And because we interpret the world through stories, when we see a lack of trust or trust that's failed, we have this negative story and we search for confirming evidence of that. And a lot of times media seems to be involved in interpreting that story for us instead of giving us the information and letting us decide for ourselves. And so we see the same narrative take place with politicians who like to vilify the other. And so in settings where we've got higher trust, there's opportunity for conversation, problem solving, collaboration. In settings where we have low trust, there's suspicion, cynicism, monitoring. And these stories tend to feed on themselves. And so we get pulled further and further apart, which is what we're seeing now, which is, trust levels are some of the lowest we've ever measured. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people talking about trust and about the symptoms that we're seeing. I was involved in a virtual conference at Duke, that was labeled Rebuilding Trust in Institutions. They were talking about the lack of trust in government, media, and technology, mostly artificial intelligence. And they were saying, we're seeing end of democracy kinds of numbers. We're seeing mass protests, we're seeing looting, we're seeing people just not obeying the laws or the rules or trying to change the rules. And somebody finally said, isn't this conference about rebuilding trust? So what do we do? And the guy running it looked into the camera and said, we just don't know. And I'm sitting in the audience going, ooh, pick me, because this is what I've been doing for the last 20 years. But so we're running into pretty profound challenges and a lack of awareness about how to fix them, about how to make things better. And I believe that the trust building is a skill that we can all get better at. But we face some real challenges, David. 95% of people believe that they're more trustworthy than average. And aside from being statistically impossible, it creates problems, because if you and I had a trust problem, you would just assume that it was me, right? Because you're trustworthy. And that means that we don't engage or try to solve these problems or try to fix them in a way that makes sense. So we all kind of sit back and go, that's somebody else's issue to deal with. And the reality is we all have the ability to get better at this and get stronger at communicating and connecting.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people forget is that trust goes both ways, doesn't it? And so most people, and your 95% statistic bears this out, I think, most people will look at the world as, do I trust that person? But then won't necessarily think about whether that person trusts them or whether they should, and what they should be doing about that as well. And it's a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah. And it's you absolutely put your finger on it. One of the challenges too is that we tend to think of trust as dichotomous, right? You either trust somebody or you don't. And that's where a lot of the research is. And that's where our heads go. When I ask people, who do you trust? They give me these close, tight personal relationships. And the reality is we trust people all the time. You go to a restaurant, you get on a plane. We get on a plane, we believe that pilot's made it through all 12 steps of that substance abuse program. And, we get in a cab, we cross the street. We're trusting people constantly. It's a social lubricant. It allows societies to function. And research tells us that communities and societies and nations with higher trust levels do better. Socioeconomically, they have much better economic growth. They tend to thrive. But when I flip that question and say, who trusts you? I get this really long pause, right? And then people will say, well, some of the same folks, my parents, my spouse, and it's hesitant. And then finally someone will say, well, how would I know, right? How do I know if someone trusts me or not? And we go back to the definition. Trust is the willingness to make yourself vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave. So there's elements of uncertainty and vulnerability. And so the question becomes, how can people make themselves vulnerable to me? And then do they? Right? And so, if I'm a leader, I start asking myself, am I the first one to get bad news? Or am I the last? Do people push back against things they don't think are going to work? Do they take risks? Are they willing to tell me what their real development needs are? Are they willing to acknowledge things that they're struggling with and share that with me? These are all ways that our people can make themselves vulnerable to us. And if they do, then they trust us. If they don't, well, not so much. And, I've worked with teams who said, oh no, we trust each other. And then after a few weeks, they go, actually, we just kind of like each other. We don't really trust each other. We don't, we're not willing to be vulnerable. We're not willing to ask for help. We're not willing to, share resources in a way that's meaningful. We're not willing to be vulnerable in a way that would be helpful.
Yes. And I've heard a few other people talking about trust in terms of almost like a spectrum. It's shades of grey. It's not on or off. And so it made me think of that as you were talking about this. Well, for society to function, we're all trusting someone to some degree, aren't we? And you're right. I trust someone to stop at the pedestrian crossing and not run me over before I walk in front of it. Things like that. Yeah. And then I also was thinking actually about an email encounter I had with someone yesterday. So this is the guy I've known for over 10 years. And he sent an email to me and a couple of other people who and the wording of it, you could have read it and thought that it was quite confrontational. But actually, because I've known him for over a decade, I read that. I was like, do you know what? That's fine. I totally get what he means.
Right.
And I've just been thinking while you were explaining that, do you know what? 10 years ago, if I'd sent that, if he'd had that email, I might have reacted very, very differently.
Exactly. It's that story we use to interpret, right?
Yeah.
And I have a seeing eye dog named Drake. And I tell people that if we all had his brain chemistry, the world would be a much better place, because he assumes a positive story of everybody. And maybe that's somewhat naive. It is, right? We have to be somewhat cautious and protective of ourselves. But he starts with a positive narrative. And if we can start with a positive story, I have two sons, Thomas and Alexander. They're the center of my world. They mean more to me than anything. And I have a relentlessly positive story about them, which means that when people come to me and have stories about them, like teachers or, other parents or whatever, my default is I'm on their side. And, they've come to appreciate that. And they understand that I have their best interest at heart. And we have conversations I never would have had with my parents. They trust me with things that are meaningful and matter. And as a parent, as your teens sort of your kids move into their teen years and young adulthood, you want them talking to you, not somebody else. Nobody cares about them the way that you do. I don't want my 18-year-old son making serious life decisions based on what his 18-year-old buddies are suggesting. Because they've got an agenda, right? I don't, other than his best interest.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Very well made. And it's something else you mentioned earlier, actually, about trust as a leader, and are people coming to you with their problems? Are you the first to hear about it? And it makes me think back at all the managers over the years. Don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions, that sort of mindset.
Right.
And that always felt a bit wrong to me, and like the wrong way around. And now I understand why, because it's a question of trust, isn't it? Because if you're the manager and you're telling your people you don't want to hear about their problems, why are they ever going to trust you with anything?
Why are you there?
Yeah, well, quite.
Right? Yeah.
It's an interesting one.
Yeah. And I we were talking earlier, I believe that the more senior we become, the more important trust becomes for us, because as we move up the corporate ladder, as we gain a larger span of control, we have less and less direct control over outcomes. We don't meet with customers. We don't turn a wrench. We don't, do client calls. We're making strategic decisions, allocating resources, those kinds of things. All of our aspirations, all of our hopes and dreams and goals are achieved through the actions of others. And so the more senior we become, the more important our soft skills or our leadership trust skills become.
Yeah, spot on. Changing tack slightly, what sets you apart from others who are talking about trust?
So there's a few things. And I struggle when I talk about this because I don't want to sound like an arrogant jerk, right? When I built my model, there were pieces that I included that hadn't been included in the literature. So not a lot of people were talking about context. In fact, I wasn't aware of anyone else who was talking about context when I first started. And I believe trust is a combination of uncertainty and vulnerability. And so when we're deciding to trust someone, we ask ourselves two fundamental questions. How likely am I to be harmed, which is perceived uncertainty? And if I'm harmed, how bad's it going to hurt, which is perceived vulnerability? And so we get uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And that means if uncertainty is high, then vulnerability's got to be low for us to still fit beneath that risk threshold. As uncertainty starts to decline, the range of vulnerability we can tolerate starts to grow and still fit beneath the threshold. And so that means that building trust is actually fairly simple. It's where does uncertainty come from and how do we take steps to reduce it? And where does vulnerability come from? And how do we take steps to help people manage it? And so I believe uncertainty comes from two places. It comes from us as individuals, and it comes from the context that we're embedded in. And so, when I was doing work with the Canadian military, helping them try to figure out how to build trust with the locals in Afghanistan, I came to realize that context is really prevalent. It's really important, especially early in relationships. It's why we trust people we don't know, right? So you go to a doctor's office, they say, take off your clothes, and you do, right? David, I've tried that in other places. It doesn't work. I'll tell people, hey, I'm a doctor. Take off your clothes.
Why does that not surprise me? Yeah.
Yeah. So context is one of the places where I differentiate, and understanding that a lot of times our actions are narrowly constrained by the context that we're embedded in. Vulnerability is another place. People tended to treat trust like a dichotomous variable, as I said, right? We either trust people or we don't. The inclusion of vulnerability lets us talk about deeper relationships, the fact that we trust some people more than others. And when I say that, people go, well, this is obvious. How did this guy get a PhD, right? And then at the back end of this, after we've made the trust decision, is our perception of the outcomes. We interpret the world through stories, and we could all have the same experience, but have dramatically different stories about what just happened and perceptions about whether it was a good outcome or not. And so I think that there are 10 levers we can pull. 4 of them reside within uncertainty. And so there's 3 that are related to us as individuals, and that's where most of the research sits. It talks about benevolence, integrity, and ability. And benevolence is a belief you've got my best interest at heart. Integrity is, do you follow through on your commitments, and do your actions line up with the values that you express? And ability is, do I have the competence to do what I say I'm actually going to do? And then there's context. And those are the 4 levers within uncertainty. There are 2 levers within vulnerability. There are 2 levers within perceived outcomes. And then in the middle of all this is our emotional states, whether we like or dislike somebody else. And 95 to 99% of the trust research treats people like they're rational actors. And I don't know if you've met people before, David, but we're not always rational, right? And so the stronger those emotional states become, the less rational we are. Love and hate are blind. And this is why we have such resilience in some of these long-term disputes. It's because we're trying cognitive, rational approaches to profoundly emotional issues. And so we need to reset those emotional states first before we can start working on some of the more cognitive, logical pieces. And so there are a number of places where I differentiate in terms of the aspects that I include: context, vulnerability, perceived outcomes, emotions, or our liking or disliking of other people. But the other piece that sort of sets me apart is the fact that I developed a really deep theoretical understanding of this during my doctoral thesis. And then I spent the last 20 years applying that. So I have a really practical applied approach that talks about how to build trust, not just looking at trust saying, isn't that interesting? Or, here's some antecedents and trust pops out the other side. I give people actual things to do to make things better. And that's a big part of the work that I do. So I have, the book that I wrote, here's my plug, Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. The masterclass that I have, all of them are focused on talking through the different levers we can pull and how to pull those to actually build stronger relationships with other people. Because we all have the ability to build trust. Some are simply better than others. And what I try to do is help people move along the continuum from wherever they are to a better place. And so those who aren't very good have a lever that they pull. Usually it's the ability lever, right? I have these kinds of credentials, this much experience, this sort of background. Those who are better have multiple levers. Those who are really good have multiple levers and they know when to pull which one. So if you and I are having a struggle and I'm pulling the ability lever, but your concern isn't about my skills, but rather about my intent, then I miss. And so I would need to pull the benevolence lever if you're worried about whether I have your interests at heart or not.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, it all fits together so well. And it's funny that you mentioned about assuming people are rational actors and the importance of that kind of emotional state or the way they view the other person. Because actually, in trying to think of an example where it wasn't the case, that was actually the central part of whether someone was trusted or not, in my own experience. Right. And that rational actor problem applies to so many things as well, doesn't it? Like economic theory, democracy, if I'm going to get a bit controversial.
Yeah.
None of them work if you assume that people make rational decisions, which very clearly they don't.
Right. Yeah. This is one of my pet peeves with economics is, some of the underlying assumptions. Assume perfect knowledge and that everyone's a rational actor.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we're 0 for 2. Yeah.
That's it. Absolutely. Yeah. There's massive parallels, of course, between leadership and trust. And a lot of what you've just said could also have been applied to leadership. And actually, leaders aren't going to get anywhere if they don't have trust in both directions, as we said earlier. So what can leaders do to ensure that they have that culture of trust and respect in their teams?
I actually have had some great experiences helping leaders develop more of a coach approach, more of a Socratic method, right? A question-based approach. A lot of it involves adopting the perspective of the other party. So I've had situations where leaders are struggling to get along with each other at senior levels, where there's conflict between them. And that's a bit of a segue, isn't it? Let me answer the first question first, and then I'll move to that. So a lot of times, I worked with a leader who was being measured. She's a fantastic leader. But her organization measured trust levels, and the measurement scale went from negative 100 to 100. And her rating was 13. And her boss kind of said to me, she needs some help, relatively new leader. Can you give her a hand? And I'd already worked with other leaders within the organization. So I came alongside and did a little bit of coaching and shared the model that I use, talked her through it. And then I sat down with her team and I said, here's what benevolence is. It means she's got your best interest at heart. What would she need to do to show that to you? And, so we start using these templates for conversations. Because a lot of times, I assume that I'm doing things in somebody else's best interest, but it doesn't land that way. And, I talk about benevolence, integrity, ability, and context on the uncertainty side. Well, that's the lever that's easiest for us to pull. Those are the sets of levers that are easiest for us. And if I start talking to you about benevolence, it makes sense, but it's not clear exactly how I pull that lever unless I include you in the conversation. And a lot of times leaders will say, well, I do all that. And my response will be, says who, right? Because if I tell you I'm benevolent, David, that doesn't carry a lot of freight. You actually have to believe it. And so I will give people a template to have a conversation. And this is what I did with this leader is, benevolence is really important for us to build strong relationships, for us to build trust together. And I think that I act benevolently, but it doesn't always land that way. Have you ever experienced that? And 99% of the time, the other person will say, yeah, I have. Because a lot of us have been misunderstood at one point or another in our lives. And then we drive the question a little deeper and we'll say, have you ever had somebody really act in your best interest? Have you ever felt like somebody really had your back? And people will go, yeah, okay, yeah, I can think of a story. Well, tell me the story. What did they do? How did they act? How did that feel? And so we start to unpack that, and it starts to cue them to what benevolence might look like for them. And it gives us hints. And then we narrow the funnel still further and we say, what does success look like for you? How can I help you get there? What would it look like if I was benevolent to you? And now we've created a zone where we can be transparent. And so if I'm a leader and a subordinate says to me, well, I want to get a promotion, it doesn't mean I'm going to be nice. It means that I'm going to act in their interest. And so I'm going to say, for you to get promoted, I would need to see the following skills. And so that means that I'm going to hold you to those expectations. And that means that I'm going to put more work on you so that you can demonstrate to me and to everyone else that you're ready for that next level. And once you start showing me that you're capable of achieving that, it reduces my uncertainty, makes me more comfortable making that decision. It also allows me to advocate on your behalf in the rest of the organization. And so you're going to be taking the lead on more projects. You're going to have higher expectations of you. And that's what benevolence is going to look like. And I'm going to keep referring back to your interest. You know, my son wanted to get a baseball scholarship. And so, you know, he told me this was his goal. And so I started saying, okay, so that means you need to have good nutrition, means you need to exercise, means you need to work hard at your sport, means you need to get along well with your coaches. You need to be a good teammate. You're going to have referrals. You're going to have to do well in school. All of these things are required for you to get to where you want to go to. And so now all of a sudden I'm asking him about those things. And in most parent-child relationships, the child feels like, oh, dad won't get off my back. He's nagging me all the time. But in this instance, it's dad's on my side. He's in my corner. And so we can see the same thing with leaders and subordinates. You know, that's how we pull the benevolence lever. And with this leader I was working with, we walked through each of the levers and talked about, how does she pull them? What's that conversation going to look like? What does integrity look like? What does ability look like? Here's the conversations you should be having with each other. And at the end of 3 months, they redid the survey and she went from 13 to 80. And so that's what leaders do, is create a shared vocabulary, start to develop some transparency around their thought processes, trying to reduce uncertainty through the context. So explaining how they're constrained, how their decisions get made, asking other people about, you know, benevolence, integrity, and ability. A lot of times ability is our favorite lever, but we still don't pull it well. So we'll ask people, who here's a great leader, and all the hands go up. And then I say, okay, what does that mean? And I get this stunned silence. And then people start saying, well, it just seemed like something I should think I'm good at. And so we start to construct it backwards, right? Who's a great leader that you've seen? What did they do? What are some of the skills that made them great? And, you know, I can say to you, I want to be the best guest you've ever had, and have in my mind what that looks like. But if I don't ask you, then the chances of me hitting the mark are pretty low. And if we don't ask your audience, you know, because they're part of the stakeholder group as well, right? And so if I really wanted to be exceptional, I'd ask you what a great guest looks like. And I'd ask your listeners, who are some of the best guests you've heard? What did they do? What was compelling? And, you know, you and I can make guesses. Like, part of it's around the storytelling. Part of it's around giving them things that they can actually do, right? Feeling like they can walk away tomorrow and have a different conversation with someone and get a different result.
Absolutely. And listeners, please feel free to express your requests, your expectations in a review, wherever it is you're listening to us, because that is the only way we really know. But anyway.
Yeah.
So I do like that. And I think there's so many things there to unpack, isn't there? But it's another aspect of trust, I guess. It's one of those concepts where a lot of people say that once you've lost it, you can never really get it back. Personally, I'd like to believe that isn't true, but then I've also seen
there wouldn't be any left.
Happen. Well, that's it, isn't it? But then I've also seen it has, you know, situations where it has been lost, and despite their best efforts and, you know, furious efforts in some cases, it was never recovered.
Right.
So it is such a huge risk to leadership in particular, and it's an all too common challenge, isn't it? So what can be done to rebuild trust if it is lost or damaged, or whichever other word you want to use to describe it? There's so many synonyms we could use, right? Indeed.
If we feel betrayed, or if trust is lost. So for me, a big part of it is partly it's an apology, but it's also partly trying to understand the other person's story and understanding. So it's not just saying, I'm really sorry that happened, because it may not have been our fault, right? So there's settings where it is our fault and we're able to acknowledge that and take ownership of it. There's settings where the context drove a decision that we didn't have a choice about. And there's settings where there's misunderstandings, right? Where, say I made a commitment to you and you heard something I didn't express, right? Or that I was, and so we walk away with different expectations. And so these violations can be small or large in nature. We can absolutely rebuild trust. The other party has to be willing. And a big part of it is, if I betrayed a trust with you, David, the onus on me, if I wanted to rebuild it, would be to acknowledge the harm that I've done. And we see this with some of the reconciliation processes. Being able to say, I'm sorry that happened. I can only imagine how disappointed you are that this had an impact on our relationship, but also your reputation with others. And so I try to think through your story. And then I ask you, what did I miss? Are there pieces of this that I am trying to apologize for that I haven't articulated? I really want to understand your story of what's just happened. And then we tell our own story. Here's why it happened from my perspective. And then we start to problem solve around how do we reduce the probability of that happening again in the future. And, integrity is important in this process because we don't want to say that'll never happen again, because that's a hard promise to keep. Instead, we want to say, let's start changing the incentive structures. Let's start changing the context. Let's start giving each other signals so that doesn't happen again, or so that we can talk about it if it starts to happen again. And so that's a big piece of it, is being able to walk through and talk about the harm that was done, the steps we're going to try to take to ensure that doesn't happen again. And then we start small, right? So, because uncertainty's bounced up, that means that we can only expect a small range of vulnerability that somebody's going to be comfortable with. So we're not going to bounce right back to where we were. We're going to start small and try to build our way back and reduce uncertainty as we go. And for me, there's the 10 levers that we can pull. And so understanding that we may have to contribute without expecting somebody to reciprocate, to respond in kind for a bit, to build up credit. And, I'll go back to that story about the two executives that were struggling with each other. And this is not unusual. One of the challenges when you write a doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments, people keep sending you to hostile environments. So just a note out there for your listeners, if they're thinking about, writing a thesis, don't do it about skinny dipping in acid or something like that. So, but I get pulled into situations where people are having a hard time getting along. And the path that I tend to follow is I'll sit with each party and say, tell me your story of what's going on and what's happened. And then I'll bring them together and say, party A, I want you to tell me what you think party B's story is. And it forces that empathy. And once they start trying to tell that story, it causes them to think about the other person's perspective. And it shows party B that they're thinking about it, that they may have a good grasp of it, and it gives them a chance to correct misperceptions or to add things to the story. And then I get party B to try to tell me party A's story. And what we're trying to do there is break down those individual stories and create a shared narrative about what's happened, the harm that's been done, and how we move forward together. So those are the approaches that I tend to try to take.
There's a common thread, I think, through all of these stories, which is communicating. You've got to have that conversation, haven't you? And I mean, there is still that base level of trust that has to exist, though, to even enter into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the parties have to be willing.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to tell you, what I do is I'll get people to pick a practice partner, right? A trust buddy to practice the skills on first. And I try to get them to pick someone fairly neutral to start with. Not someone who loves us and not someone who hates us, so that they've got room to play and practice. And it feels they struggle to start. Even in a low risk environment. Because it feels vulnerable. And right now, with uncertainty as high as it is, part of the reason we have such low trust levels is that our vulnerability hasn't really declined, but our uncertainty is bouncing all over the place. We're seeing changes in norms and values. We're seeing pandemics. We're seeing climate change. We're seeing, all of these things shifting. And that means uncertainty is bouncing all over the place, which means that we're really uncomfortable because our risk perception is bouncing beyond the threshold and below it, beyond it and below it, which means that people are really uncomfortable taking on additional vulnerability. And so when I say to people, hey, let's just have a conversation, they struggle to start. And I've had people say to me, well, how would I even begin? Right. And so I've started giving people templates for conversations, or give them questions that they can use to just start to practice. And routinely what they say is, it feels awkward. It's a new skill that I'm trying to move. But the response is so positive, right? So, I gave you the template for the benevolence conversation before. We could have a similar conversation around what does excellence look like. And you and I did. We talked briefly about what a good guest would look like at the start of this. And so we can have these conversations about, what is excellence in my role? What do you think a good colleague looks like? What do you think a good leader looks like? Well, even asking that question feels vulnerable, right? Because what if they say, not you? I have these conversations with my sons where I'll say, what's a good dad? What would make a really good dad? And, I'm legally blind. I've got post-concussion syndrome, a little thin on top. Like, there are plenty of flaws in me, right? I mean, I make mistakes. I forget things. So there's plenty of opportunity for improvement. For a complete list of my flaws, you'd have to check out my ex-wife's blog. It's heavy reading, but it's very detailed. So, we feel this sense of vulnerability even starting these conversations. But if I started with someone saying, hey, I'm taking a trust course, or I heard this guy talk about trust and I'm trying to understand it better, I'd like to practice with you to try to see if we can have a better relationship. How often do you think people say, no, thanks, I'm not interested? They just don't, right? They're like, oh, I'm kind of flattered that you would think of me that way. And so the responses tend to be really positive. And once people get their toe dipped into the water, they start to find it's easier and easier to practice. So, yeah, I hope that it felt like I meandered a bit there, David, but I hope it answered the question.
Yeah, I think it does. And it's changing the mindset, isn't it? And I think if you're it doesn't matter which side of the story you're in, but I think particularly if you're the leader, you're right, there's a certain amount of courage needed to be willing to do that in the first place.
Yeah.
And self-reflection as well, no doubt.
It's a hard time to be a leader, David. I mean, the definition of what excellence is a moving target.
Indeed.
And expectations seem to be changing. And what made a great leader 10 years ago doesn't seem to be what makes a great leader now. And
absolutely. Or even 2 years ago,
Yeah. Yeah. And so, and I'm seeing more and more leaders really struggle to transition. There are things that they were great at that got them to where they are. They struggle to let go of those and step into new challenges, the new requirements of being exceptional at this next level. because they're worried about making mistakes. And I've talked to so many leaders who have this mindset of, if I make one mistake, I'm finished. And that means that they're terrified and they can tolerate no uncertainty. And that means they start micromanaging the crap out of everybody that they lead, because they can't let them make mistakes either, right? Which strangles creativity, makes it harder for us to adapt and evolve. Truly great leaders now need to be able to step into the unknown a bit more, take risks, and encourage that with their teams.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's micromanagement is perhaps the most common, but I think the other route that some leaders go is they just refusal to admit they've made mistakes.
Right.
Particularly in politics, especially in this country. Let's not get into that too much. Perhaps one of your southern neighbours as well, shall we go?
Oh yeah, it's like living in the attic of a meth house being in Canada right now.
Yeah, but I mean, the reason I mention it, and not to get on the political soapbox again, but there's nothing more damaging to trust, in my experience, than someone who's made a mistake. Everyone knows the mistake happened. They know who was responsible for it and should be accountable for it, and they just adamantly refuse to admit that they've even made it. And I mean, British politics is full of that right now. So
it's this complete lack of integrity, right? It's
indeed.
And we saw this during the pandemic, where, people would come out with, okay, this is what we should do. And then a few months later, they would change the narrative around, okay, so, and instead of saying, we've come to learn more about the virus and best practice has changed, and what we said before was best practice as far as we knew, and this is new best practice, they just acted like they never said the first thing. Which was incredibly damaging to trust levels.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many examples to pick, but I mean, certainly in the UK, I mean, we had at some points just farcical situations. And
this is why the CDC had a playbook for the pandemic. And I talk about this in my book. And it was basically get the politicians out of the room, because half the population don't trust them. And I was fortunate, and there are people who have come to not like her, but we had a woman named Bonnie Henry who was head of public health here, and she was amazing. And the government was remarkably smart, because they just stepped back and said, she's driving the bus. And she would say, this is what we're going to do. This is the plan. And then the government would come out and go, yeah, what she said. And they had a minority government going into the pandemic. And in the middle of it, they called an election and they got a majority. And it was basically because they were smart enough to realize they weren't smart enough. And, if we'd had more jurisdictions sort of moving in that direction, where they had stopped making it a political football, and instead it said, we're going to follow the science and acknowledge that the science is going to change as we learn and grow and develop, we would have been better served. Yeah,
I think so. And without getting into the politics, because I'm sure at least half of the listeners disagree with what I've said about our Prime Minister there. But the reason I mention it is, agree or disagree with that particular example, the key thing there was consistency, and there wasn't any, because regardless of which side you were listening to, they were disagreeing. So
and it provokes such uncertainty, right? And
indeed,
we see different rules in different jurisdictions for different companies, for different countries, and it becomes very confusing, and you don't know who to listen to or who to believe. And part of the challenge for the medical community is that they were very focused on the virus itself. And we're now starting to see some of the mental health impacts, some of the economic impacts. And so we did need a blended approach. And hopefully that's lessons learned for the next time we have something like this.
Yeah, well, hopefully it'll be at least 100 years in the future, and you and I won't have to worry about it. But
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, so to put it in a business context, I guess it's an important question because for trust, because uncertainty, as you say. But if you've got, say, different management levels, so if you've got, say, a VP and a director who disagree on something and they're not being consistent in the way they put that across to the staff, it's so damaging to everything, like not just the uncertainty and the levels of trust, but the morale of the team, the productivity, ability to just get the work done because you're following two masters, I guess is the phrase. But.
And it's challenging to know who to pick. And, there's significant consequences when you're forced to choose camps. And this integrity piece is a real challenge because it really undermines morale. A lot of times we'll talk to organizations and they'll talk about the things that are written on the wall, the values and the mission statements and all that kind of stuff. And it's a source of cynicism. Because these are promises that are being made that aren't being kept. And there are times when decisions get made where you're sort of like, well, how does that line up with what we're supposed to be all about? And unless we are able to, when I talk about integrity with folks, I talk about you need to be able to tell the story that links your decisions back to your values. And you need to tell that story because otherwise people make up their own. And I worked with a company, it's a telecom company in Canada, and their tagline was "The future's friendly." And I'm sitting in a room with 8 VPs, and I said, "What does that mean?" And they all just looked at me and they said, "Well, we didn't think there was going to be a quiz. We don't actually know." And I said, "So what promises are you making to your customers?" Because I know that some of your employees say the future's friendly. It's the present that you got to worry about. And they said, well, it's supposed to mean that, the future's here now and it's a friendly place. That's what the marketing VP finally said, because the rest of them actually didn't know what it was supposed to mean. And so if we're going to have integrity, which is one of the best ways for us to be able to predict somebody's future actions, right? Then we need to make it clear what the story is, how it connects back to our values. We also need to be really clear about, here's the promise I made. Here's me following through on that promise. So that there's no lack of clarity, so that there isn't an alternative story that can be thrown in your face. We need to be collaborative in how we create these narratives. A lot of times we just assume other people understand or that they've got the same story that we do.
Yeah, and that first step is having a tagline or a value that's actually means something and can be achieved, right? Because the future is friendly. I mean, it sounds like even the person who wrote that didn't really know what it meant. It just sounded like a good marketing phrase. How do you know the future's friendly? We're not there yet. We can't see
exactly
it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll be nice tomorrow.
Yeah, no, you gotta laugh at things like that, haven't you? Anyway, well, I mean, integrity. Obviously, I'm going to say that is a very important thing because the title of the podcast is, after all, leading with integrity. So that leads us quite nicely into the next few questions, which are a bit more specific about leadership. And what is the biggest leadership lesson that you've learned in your career so far?
There are a few of them. And the book, I focused my book around leadership because I thought that was the biggest impact to have. And it's the work that I tend to do most often. A lot of times so the biggest gap we find is between how much leaders believe they're trusted and how much they actually are. And so I think introspection and self-awareness is one of the big keys for leaders. Being active, I can't tell you how many times leaders have said to me, yeah, my people really need your work. And the thought through my head is, yes, so do you. But they often don't see it that way, right? It's back to that 95% believe that they're trustworthy. Well, leaders are no different than the rest of us in that perspective. They believe that if there are trust problems, it's somebody else's issue to deal with. And so, I talk a lot to people about internal versus external locus of control. And when I used to teach undergrads, I would say to them, internal locus of control means you're master of your own destiny. You make things happen in the world. You're an actor. And an external locus of control means things happen to you. You're buffeted by the winds of fate. And I'd say, who here has an internal locus of control? And they were all good young capitalists, so all the hands go up. And I said, this is fantastic news. So if you don't do well in the class, it's not because I didn't teach it properly or the test was too hard. It's all you, baby. And they kind of go, oh, wait a minute. I said, that's right. We tend to have an internal locus of control when we're successful and an external locus of control when we fail. My sons both play sports. They've never lost in a sporting event where the ref didn't suck. And so, a lot of times the problem that creates for us, particularly for leaders, is that we don't learn lessons from failure. And we don't examine closely enough the context that created our successes. And so a lot of times we need to be able to sit back and say, okay, we were profoundly successful. What were the situations so that I can identify those settings again in the future to take those same risks? And if we failed, what was the role that we played in that failure? How could we have changed and learned and grown from that so that we have an improved probability of being successful next time? And so I think for me, that's one of the biggest challenges is helping leaders become more self-aware around topics like trust. More self-aware around, creating shared narratives, adopting perspectives of others. I think those are the biggest challenges that I've seen.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you again, I must say. I think one kind of edge case maybe, I guess, is, I've seen a lot of leaders make that same mistake, and a couple of them, I've asked them about it and be like, well, looking back, you do see that was a mistake, right? And some of the more interesting responses I've had, not many, but a few of them, has been along the lines of, yeah, but I have to back myself. I have to have that self-belief. Otherwise, I can't do what I do. And I don't want to risk damaging that self-belief by looking at something I've done as an error or a mistake. And so I think there is a balance. You have to have both, because I agree, like, if you don't believe in yourself, you can't lead others. Right. But at the same time, you're not going to lead others well if you can't reflect, acknowledge, and address your mistakes.
Right.
So I don't know. How do you think is the best way to balance those two competing forces, if you like?
Well, I think, for me, do you think that a leader is the same leader on day one of the job as they are after 10 years of experience?
No, true.
No. So they learn and grow and develop and become stronger at it. And so there's a bunch of skills that they grow and develop and evolve. And so an awareness that there is growth that's coming. So you're right. It's a balancing act between confidence and humility. One of the gaps I find, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, I think, but there's some gender differences. The best leader I've ever seen is a woman named Kelsey Trigg, and she works with SAP. She's the head of HR advisors globally for them. She and her group serve 9,000 leaders within SAP all over the world. She's brilliant. But women tend to have a confidence-competence gap more often than men do. And so they don't have as much confidence as their abilities would warrant. And the research suggests that women will apply for a more senior position when they believe they're perfect for it. Men will apply for a more senior position if they think they have any shot at all. And so there's this gap that needs to be closed for a lot of female leaders between their confidence in their abilities and their actual abilities. The reverse may be true for some male leaders, right? Where they may have confidence far in excess of their competence.
I was going to say that was going to be my next question. Was, do you think it is that there's a gap for women, or is it actually the opposite gap for men?
It's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of both, because I've talked to some women who are remarkably capable, but don't have the confidence that should match that. I think we're also seeing, and this is, we're talking about leadership and the fact that, a lot of people are talking about the dearth of great leaders. The role is evolving, and it's becoming so complex and so demanding, that we're not always getting the people we want in those senior positions. So, when I've talked with a number of female leaders at a certain level of an organization, they'll say, yeah, all the roles above me are inhabited mostly by men. And I say, well, would you want one of those more senior roles? They say, not on your life. I'm not willing to give up my family. I'm not willing to give up everything else in my life. And so the people we get evolving into some of those roles are the ones who don't really give a crap about anybody else. They're profound narcissists who are fine with their family never seeing them again, who are so invested in their own success and self-aggrandizing that they don't care about the consequences for anyone else. Those aren't really the people we want in the most senior roles. And it's not the people we want in politics either. And that's where we're getting what we're getting, right? We want people who have a more balanced, nuanced perspective. And so maybe leadership needs to become a team sport rather than an individual one.
Yeah, I do see where you're coming from, and I don't disagree with you necessarily.
Yeah,
I mean, it's something that comes up quite a lot, actually, particularly lately, even with other podcast guests a few times. And I guess my question is, how much of the problem is a structural one with the way that our modern approach to business and promotion and progression works, even hiring practices?
Yeah.
And how much of it is about leadership itself? And we'll put politics aside, because I think that's its own beast because of the whole media and vested interests and social media and all of that. Because that has more of an impact there, I think, than it does.
Yeah.
I hope it does, than it does in the business world.
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. There are some exceptions in the business world, but for the most part, the rules are different. And I like to engage in a thought experiment with folks. Imagine there were no bad guys, right? Imagine there were no villains. There are just people responding to the context that they're presented with. And I think that the rules or the structures are having a profound impact on who evolves into which roles and how we select them. And we've just allowed those things to evolve. We haven't been really thoughtful about creating environments that are more conducive to the types of leaders that we want. We also haven't done a great job of identifying what good looks like. We haven't really sat down and said, historically we talked about some great leaders, right? Winston Churchill was considered a great leader during wartime, right? And then after wartime, he was not so great. And so within a certain context, he was a great leader. And we've seen different leaders evolve during different periods in time. We should be having more fundamental conversations about what excellence is for a leader in the times of profound change that we're seeing right now. And I think that, and this is just my perspective, but the command and control style is dying, and it has to, because it doesn't allow us to be fast enough. It doesn't allow us to adapt quickly enough. And it doesn't engage, the new generations that are moving through these organizations at all. And so we need leadership styles that are more inclusive, that are more egalitarian, that are more collaborative in nature. And we see profound value from higher trust levels. It leads to better returns to shareholders, higher employee engagement, higher customer retention. The list goes on and on about all the positive benefits. Well, it's become even more valuable because it's so scarce. And so leaders who are going to really thrive and excel are ones who are going to be really good at building those kinds of cultures and communities where people want to stay, where they want to excel, where they're willing to go through a wall. We historically have talked about organizational citizenship behaviors, people going above and beyond. Well, when you can create environments like that where people are willing to contribute, social capital is another concept that gets used to talk about people investing in the organization or the community that they're in with an expectation that it's going to lead to a benefit for all and that they're going to be included in that. Those are the kinds of leaders that are going to excel. Yes,
I think a couple of things. So, I totally agree with you about the evolving nature of leadership and how it needs to better meet today's challenges. If I think back to when I first started my career, one example that stands out, and we've already mentioned it, is confidence versus competence.
Right.
And so when I took my first job, whenever leadership was discussed, it was always in the context of confidence. A leader is a confident, outgoing person who can speak their mind and issue clear instructions and delegate effectively. And, they're this proactive, exciting sort of person. Today, I think actually the emphasis is flipped. It needs to be more now about competence. And within that, we have to include things like trust building, effective listening, good communication skills, same thing really, and not really about that sort of shouty, do as I say, immediately jump how high, all that kind of analogy, because it just doesn't work. People aren't up for that anymore. They're not going to take that leadership. They're going to leave. They're going to take their skills elsewhere. And so that also feeds into what you're saying about the command and control style of leadership too. So the autocrat, if you like. Even a benevolent dictator is still a dictator.
Right.
And it's interesting because when you said that it's not fast enough, most times when I get into that conversation about why that style of leadership isn't effective, the counter argument people come back at me with is, but it's faster. We can make decisions quicker.
Right.
Yeah, you can. But if you empower your people to make their own decisions, then they don't have to wait for you to make the decision. And therefore it's going to be quicker, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. Because the challenge is that by the time my command gets to the bottom level where it needs to be, the need may have changed. Right. And so, and the other problem you run into is, leadership is moving back and forth as things change and evolve. And the people behind them are like a snake, right? Some of them are following and some aren't. And after a while, they start going, I'm not going to uproot myself and move over there because I know you're coming back in 6 months. So I'm just going to stay here and wait. And, it's great to plant the flag and bravely wave the troops onward. But if they all just stand there and look at you, it's not very effective. And, sometimes I've had people say to me, well, I try to be inclusive, and then people think that I'm incompetent. And so we need to be clear about the story as well, right? We try not to let kindness be confused for weakness. And so we need to be able to tell the story as we go along of, look, I have understandings and ideas about how we're going to progress with this, but I want to include other people in the conversation. And I'm going to get information that informs my decision, but I'm going to make the final decision. Okay. The way we're able to provide structure and create clarity for folks, that's really the challenge right now, is in tumultuous environments. How do we create certainty? How do we make people feel like they're in a safe harbor? And that's the role for leadership at this point, is getting people into a place where they feel like they can all contribute. They all want to be there, and they're engaged and pulling in the same direction.
Agreed. I think the other key thing that's changed as well, and another reason why that sort of top-down approach doesn't work, is it sort of assumes that the manager or the leader knows more about everything than the people they're leading. And that's just not true anymore, is it? Especially in a virtual context. I mean, how can it be?
Yeah. I often talk to people who have risen from technical expertise into management positions. And they said, my technical expertise lasted for about 6 months after I stopped using it. I was no longer ahead of the curve. I mean, I could still talk to people, but I didn't have the same level of understanding that they did anymore. And that's, one of the places where I've found significant success with the trust model that I use is it actually gives people practical applied approaches that they can use to have conversations. And some of those technical leaders have come back to me and said, I didn't understand people at all. And you gave me a playbook, like you gave me a manual for actually having conversations. And so it's a skill that we can all build. And it's one that leaders are going to need. I mean, there's always going to be environments until AI takes over. There's always going to be environments where, you need to be closer to employees, where they're engaged in sort of mundane tasks, and you're going to need to keep them kind of motivated and interested, and you're going to have to stay on top of things. And there's, different styles needed for different types of employees in different situations. So, leadership is a multifaceted thing. But boy, the more senior you become, the more pronounced the need is for this ability to get people wanting to make their own decisions, feeling empowered to do so, and actually taking ownership.
I'm going to move on from there, despite it being a very interesting conversation, just because I'm conscious of time.
Yeah.
So I'll skip a couple of questions. Let's go with this one. What advice would you have for any aspiring business owners in the audience?
I'm going to be biased here, because I think that trust is foundational. And there was a great piece by Simon Sinek where he was talking about the Navy SEALs preferring trust over competence. You need a certain baseline of competence, but I would be trying to hire for fit, more than just skills, because we can train people most of the time to have the skills they need. And I believe that hiring and promotion are trust decisions, because we make ourselves vulnerable to new employees. We make ourselves vulnerable when we promote someone. And a lot of times I'll have conversations with people who are looking for new jobs about how they should approach interviews, and pulling not just the ability lever, which we tend to pull, right? Here's my credentials, here's my experience, here's my background. But also pulling the benevolence and integrity lever. Well, we can do the same thing as employers, trying to get a better sense of those we're about to lead. Because let's be honest, I mean, we're spending a lot of time with these people. Wouldn't it be nice if they were actually able to fit together, if they were actually able to work together? And who wants to hire two people that are going to fight constantly? Boy, that sounds like a pain. So I would try to hire for fit and work through the skill pieces afterwards.
Yeah, I agree. I think the way you define fit is quite important as well, though, because what you don't want is everyone who just agrees with you all the time. You do need those alternative points of view as well. And that's not mutually exclusive with someone who's still going to fit within your organization, be a good culture fit and someone you can get on with and work well together with. But I think it's important not to conflate that with someone who's going to agree with you.
Yeah. And that's the challenge that we face often, David, is we like people who are like us, right?
Exactly.
And so, a good friend of mine, Tony Simons, is talking about something he calls the golden triad. I can't remember exactly. It's golden something. But he said diversity lends both benefits and challenges. The benefits are clear in that you're able to appeal to a broader audience. If I'm a business owner, I want to be able to bring clients from all over. I don't want to just have people buying from me who are like me. I want everyone to feel welcome and compelled to engage with my organization. It's also much easier for me to draw from a broader talent pool than it is to fish in the same pond as everyone else. So there are some real benefits from diversity. There are also challenges that come with it because it provokes uncertainty, right? We may be playing by different rules. We have different backgrounds, expectations. We may have different stories. And so we need to create some kind of harmony within these settings. To get there, to get the benefits from diversity, we need dialogue. We need communication. To get communication, we need trust. And so trust is sort of at the foundation level for all these things. And so, at the risk of sounding self-interested, if folks are thinking about building an organization or taking on a new leadership role or improving that, they should buy my book and probably take the masterclass, to think about how they're going to build stronger trust-based relationships within that organization, even though there's different opinions, and to find a place where people, Amy Edmondson talks about psychological safety. Well, how do we create an environment that's psychologically safe, where people can take risks, where they can have different opinions, where we can have conversations that are hard for us to have, either internally or with stakeholders, without some level of trust there?
Yeah, that psychological safety is so important. Yeah, I mean, I've worked for bosses in the past where the opposite was true, and I think that all it's done is underlines me how important it is.
Yeah,
maybe I'm biased because I was the one not being listened to, but there we go.
Well, I remember one of my first job experiences. I was a co-op student, so I got placed in a government agency during my master's, and they started checking my photocopying. And at the end of the first day, I'd calculated how many hours were left on my contract because I was so eager to not be there anymore. Right. And so, we hear things like quiet quitting, bare minimum Mondays, like all these different analogies for switching to glide. And that's the cost associated with having low trust environments.
Yeah, absolutely. And traditionally, I would place that responsibility squarely with the leaders because, for me, like if people are doing the bare minimum of their contract, I mean, first of all, that's not always necessarily a bad thing. If you wanted more, you should have negotiated it in the contract.
Sure.
You can't be like, well, they're only working 9 to 5. Yes, because that's what you're paying them to work. Like, what else do you expect?
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you want more, maybe look, in the mirror. Is it something to do with your leadership? Are you perhaps not inspiring, encouraging, supporting them, giving them a reason to work more, in that example anyway?
I had a really interesting conversation with a senior VP for North America for a big multinational. He said, my people are so tentative. They don't take risks. They're, passive, all this kind of stuff. I looked at him and I said, yeah, that's you. And he goes, what? I said, you're creating an environment where people are scared to make mistakes. And he kind of went, no one's ever said that to me before. And I said, well,
funny that.
That's, yeah. Wow. So it led to a great conversation. We had a great relationship.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, it kind of says it all, really, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Leadership Heroes.
Only one question left. So the question is, if you had to pick one person, and they can be alive, dead, past, present, real or fictitious, if you like.
Yeah.
Who, in your opinion, would perfectly embody leadership who would that person be and why?
So I'm going to go probably off the list here. And I mentioned her before. Kelsey Trigg is my leadership hero. She works in a remarkably difficult environment, right? Because she's got a virtual team that's truly global. She serves 9,000 leaders from all over the world. So there's all these cultural differences. There's challenges of time zone differences, all of those kinds of things. And her team is evaluated. Their trust scores are measured, and their client appreciation scores are measured, and they're through the roof. And she's working in a technology company. SAP is a big software organization. Not all those people are hired for their people skills. And so in a remarkably challenging environment, she is excelling. And, it's a combination of, she's extremely bright and capable. But she's also got a real human perspective. She, has gone through the trust work with me. I've coached her and her team. They use the vocabulary, they use the language. But she's a star in a really difficult environment.
Great pick. It's actually quite surprisingly quite rare that I get people picking people they've met or who they know, outside of parents and family members anyway.
Right.
Yeah, it's usually like some historical figure like a Roman emperor, or Winston Churchill has come up a couple of times now as well.
Gandhi would be a good pick.
Yeah, Gandhi's come up. Yeah, George Washington a couple of times as well. So yeah, no, it's harder for me to comment on someone I've not heard of and haven't met though. So except to say, I like your reasoning. I can't argue with it, and thank you for telling us the story.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been such a pleasure being with you today, David. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, likewise. It's been a really wide-ranging conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And yeah, so last thing is, if the listeners would like to learn more about you or what you do, or perhaps get a copy of your book, is there a website or anything you want to point them towards?
Yeah, so the Trust Unlimited trustunlimited.com is my website. Mm-hmm. There's articles on there. There's other podcasts. They probably won't be as good as this one, but there are links to my book there. The book can also be found anywhere you buy books online. Darryl Stickel's Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. And there's a masterclass, and I've been having remarkable success with people using the masterclass and reading the book, helping their leadership skills. So if your listeners are interested in honing some of those skills, that's the place that they can go.
Well, Darryl, thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to leave you to get back to the rest of your day. Must be nearly time for breakfast where you are.
Almost.
All right, well, thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, David.
Thanks again, Darryl. That was really useful conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed myself there, and I hope the listeners, well, I'm sure the listeners have got plenty of value out of that as well. Listeners, if you would like to learn more, I have put the website link in the episode description, so you can reach out to Darryl, get a copy of his book, perhaps attend his masterclass, and so on. If you'd like to learn more about leading with integrity and the programs that I can offer as well, again, there is a website in the episode description. Please feel free to visit that. You can find links there to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you can contact me directly by email. There's a button in the top right corner of the website. And that's all I have time for today, I'm sorry to say. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do leave a review, and don't forget to subscribe as well so you don't miss future episodes. Look forward to the next episode, when I hope you'll join me again. And in the meantime, remember, be a leader, not a boss.